Bridging. Generation gaps, socioeconomic gaps, gender gaps, cultural gaps. Bridging gaps that cause confusion, division, and chaos in today's society. And now, let's join our moderator, host, and guest for another provocative episode of Bridging.
Hi, I'm LauraBeth, and I'm your host for Bridging. And I am joined today by Melinda Hardin, Allison Coates, and Miss Bridgette Bowman. And we are going to discuss racism. It is something that our country is facing very hard right now. And I just want to discuss what is going on and how we can address it and how we can help overcome it. Welcome, guys.
Thank you.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Now, I just want to ask a little about your background. Melinda, where did you grow up and how was it growing up?
I grew up in a sleepy suburb, rural town in Missouri, outside of Kansas City. That the interesting part about it was that when I look back at it now, it was an accepted, somewhat segregational situation, but that was how we grew up. All of the African Americans grew up on one side of town, and it was generational. We knew where our place was. We knew what we did. We walked certain paths going to school. We all knew each other, and that's just how it was. And we were okay with that. I had a good childhood and I enjoyed the things that went along with that. However, there were some struggles in that, in knowing who I was and understanding why certain things were the way they were, and having those conflicts at times of why I could go over certain friends' houses and other times I couldn't go over other friends' houses or do certain things, and always having to know and be aware of my surroundings, who I was, where I was, and things of that nature, that at times made life a little bit more difficult than it probably should have been.
Allison, what about you? Where did you grow up? How was it for you growing up?
I grew up in Memphis. And in the early years, my dad was a baseball coach at the University of Memphis, or Memphis State. And we lived on campus. My parents were dorm parents to the baseball team. And so I had the fortune of being able to go to campus school, which is an elementary school on the University of Memphis campus. And so my first schooling years were with diverse, it was a diverse school, and there were other children that didn't look like me. But it really, I don't remember that being a problem. As far as playing on the playground, going over to each other's houses, most of my friends were white, but I did have some African American friends, and was Jewish friend. I mean, it was just a very diverse school for 1963, 5, somewhere around there, and but yet I was in a predominantly white community. At very young age, I do remember going to the zoo and asking my mom why there were 2 different bathrooms, why we couldn't go to the bathroom over there, and she'd say, no, we have to use this bathroom over here. Or riding a bus downtown, I just remember, but I don't really remember facts or anything that went with that.
Yeah.
But generally, it was a white upbringing.
Okay.
But it wasn't well, I'm sure there was prejudice in there, but, you know, I don't remember anything right now that stands out.
Okay. And Bridgette, how was it for you growing up?
Well, I grew up in the state of Virginia, a little town called Hopewell, Virginia. And much like Melinda, our town growing up was literally divided by the railroad tracks, right? You had Black people on one side of the tracks, white people on the other. And geographically, that didn't make any sense to me as a child. I didn't recognize any of those things. Growing up was a little bit different. I think I was able to live in both worlds, and I'm not sure if that was a good thing or a bad thing. And I say that because when I started going to kindergarten, schools were segregated. However, my parents sent me to a Christian school. And it was me and a young man by the name of Michael McPherson. We were the only 2 Black kids in the class. And so that was our lives for 2 years. For me, my parents, color was never an issue in our house, but I guess that we'll get into that too, because I don't think color is ever an issue in a Black person's house. I think that's one of the cultural differences. So you just kind of did and you went through life. Now, when I started hearing about color growing up, I was hearing things like you have to go and you always have to do twice as much and be twice as good to even be noticed, right?
Yep.
Not to be, you know, any of that. So you grew up knowing that in order to be the person you wanted to be, that there was a different standard of excellence for me, and that was based on the color of my skin. I would have to give more and do more and try harder and be better. And, you know, again, that's where that saying, being early, you're on time. If you're on time, you're late. And if you're late, don't bother. So those types of standards came into our lives then. And then again, being a teenager, it made a difference, right? Because then you had the dating scene where there were no-nos, and we had some people who crossed that line, but then being traced or chased home after football games, right? Trying to get across those railroad tracks. So yeah, sit up on the bluff of our city and watch the Klan meetings down on the riverfront and hope nobody saw you. I mean, so yes, you had glimpses of it, but I grew up in a time in the 60s and 70s where my parents did a really good job to make sure that I was confident in me and that I knew the rules. And there were rules, but those rules never made me hate. They just made me work really hard.
Well, I'm going to tell you a little about me growing up. I grew up in the middle of the country. I think the first time I ever saw an African American was probably when I went to school. And there wasn't many. I can recall maybe 3 in my kindergarten class, maybe 4. And I became best friends with one of them, but it became an issue at home because my parents were racist. And it was more my dad than it was my mom, but it became hard. She wasn't allowed to call my house. She couldn't come see me. I couldn't go see her. It was a lot of pushback for me, and I didn't understand. I still don't think I have the mentality to understand that as an adult, and I'm 39 years old. So, I mean, I grew up in the 80s, in the 90s. I was born in 81, so I didn't start school until later, mid 80s. So it was the 80s and the 90s, and things were changing, but there were still so much to change because all my friends were like, well, I can go to their house or I can go to their house. And then I had other friends who were like, no way. So it was hard for me. But I always saw everybody as people. I never saw a problem with color. And my dad tried to get us to see the color. We weren't allowed to watch Black television. If I wanted to watch Fresh Prince, it had to be when Daddy wasn't home. Or I couldn't watch... I can't think of the name of the show, Family Matters. I couldn't watch those shows. When my dad was home, we heard racial slurs about getting that off the TV. So it was hard for me. But we'll get into that a little more. I just want to ask Allison.
Ma'am.
When I met you, it was actually a very good time in my life because I was on this wonderful journey and I would love to go on again. But you told us about some Black young men that you help raise. Can you tell us a little background about that and how that came about?
Well, my own children were older. One was in college and one was on our own. And my husband volunteered for a Memphis football team to coach. And so he was the only white coach. And each coach was given about 5 or 6 boys to mentor. And so the boys that he was mentoring, one of them asked him one day if they could go to church with us. And so that was basically how it started, as far as with the about 5 boys that that we just, grew a relationship with. Before that, we had both volunteered at Streets Ministry and done Bible studies and worked with kids. I worked with 8th grade girls, and I can't remember what my husband's age group was. But so there had been a little bit of, relationship building before that. And then it carried on once my husband was a volunteer coach.
Was there ever a time that you were like, no, we don't need to do this. We don't need to get involved with the African American community?
Well, in the beginning, when John came home, and said the guys want to go to church and everything, and I thought, okay, I wonder, what this is about. And my daughter brought up a good statement. And it was one, I think we had to look at it, or there were other people that looked at the situation and wanted to know, if we were doing this because so the boys could be a project, or were the boys going to be a threat? And so I think that, I don't think I asked myself that, but I think people that we came encounter with were wondering, is this a do-good thing? What is this all about? Why did the kids want to come, to a predominantly white church?
Right.
And there, after some time went by, it was much more pleasant and much more interactive. But then again, there were people that were like, what can we do to help? What can we do to help? Who were almost being too nice.
Right.
If that makes sense. So I think I would say the biggest way to our relationship was that all the boys in my family, it was a trust. It was building a trust. Just making sure that they didn't want to be in a relationship with us for the something, and us just be in the relationship feeling like we're doing something good.
Right. That makes sense. And I see you smiling, Bridgette. Do you, if you would have came upon them, what would have went through your mind?
I think everything that Allison said. I mean, oftentimes, and I'll be honest with you, I mean, Allison, I go to a whole different point, a whole different place, right? Because oftentimes I see in the church, namely the white church, that people can get on an airplane and go 8,000 miles, right, to adopt a kid. And so, and so I have all these questions in my mind about, the why, when we have a huge mission field right here. And why a Chinese kid or Asian kid versus a Black kid. But then, working in the juvenile justice system, I would oftentimes see more white foster care parents than Black. And in my mind, I'm thinking, where are the Black foster care parents, right? But the Christian in me shouldn't even care. It should have said, oh my God, isn't that wonderful that somebody has this baby? So again, it creeps into our psyche even when we don't want it to. And then I asked the question, like you said, Allison, is this a project? Is this white guilt? Is this a check off? Is this a project? I mean, what is it? And the last thing is always, it's because they love children and they want to help. Yeah. You always get through the ulterior motives only to arrive at hopefully a good place.
What are your thoughts on that, Melinda?
Literally everything that Miss Bridgette just said. And that honestly comes from the upbringing. It comes from the pre-programmed information that is put into us as we grow, the things to look out for, the things to pay attention to, and the things that we see around us and that are there and to watch out for and to pay attention to. And I agree with you, Miss Bridgette. My husband and I were foster care parents for quite some time. And one of those things that when we would say that we don't have bias, we have bias too. We as African Americans, a lot of us have bias as well. And it comes pre-programmed in from what we have been through and from things that we have seen and experienced. We have our own biases that we bring to the table, that once we go through our biases and our issues, we arrive at an answer at the end that we hope is one of good and of purative motives. But like others, we have to go through all those other phases and stones in order to get there.
Right. And to Allison's point, I think the other thing for me is I was one of those projects, right? I grew up poor, but I never knew it, right? So my mother and my siblings, because I'm the youngest of 10, and my sibling next to me is actually 13 years older than me, right? So a bunch of mothers and dads. And so I was always taken care of. So I never knew the realities of who we were and how we were economically. But in that, I was that person, and I'll even make it even more clear, right? On Emmaus, I was, one of the educated Black women, right? And so I was always a project, whether it was the little Black girl whose mom dresses her really nice every day. Let's get her to be that token, or being the mouthy one in high school that refused to be ignored. And so, you had to be a part of something, but you became those projects for people. You were the one who took on the burden of whether it was all the Black girls in your class or everybody from the street you lived on, or for your entire race. And so those questions come up. When I see other people in relationships, I wonder, is that same thing happening to them?
Mm-hmm.
You bring that up, and I'm married to a Black man, and I love him unconditionally. And I felt that God brought us together. I was praying for a man to help me raise my 2 children. I was a single mom, and I was working full time and going to college full time. And this man appears in front of me, and I fell in love at the first moment. Unfortunately, he was in another relationship, but we've been together for over 13 years now, and I wouldn't change it for anything in the world. Of course, my parents didn't agree with me, so we had a strained relationship, but we tried to build it back up, but both of them are gone now. But I do have a relationship with my sisters. I have 3 sisters, and we have a good relationship. Melinda, tell me a little about your goddaughter. I know that she is mixed, as my children are.
We have a goddaughter that we raised from birth, Riea, along with our adoptive sons. And she, unlike most mixed children, like my husband, is mixed. And he tends to identify with the African American culture more so than the Caucasian culture. And most of my friends who are mixed tend to identify with one culture over another culture, more so, and identifying and saying, I identify more so with this side. She tends to identify with both sides equally, between her 2 sides that make up who she is. And sometimes we talk with her in making sure that she understands culturally, yes, she is the side of both sums. But reminding her, and that comes again from just our own upbringing and the things that we were taught, and reminding certain things historically of where certain things lie, because generationally, as we have continued to go along, our younger generations see things very, very differently than I seen them, that my mother's seen them, and that my grandmother saw them. And so having conversations about race, about interracial relationships, all those things sound and look very different from when my mother had them with me and now me having them with her. And her looking and seeing things, and a lot of the racial issues that are going on right now, it is culture shock for my children, because if you had to ask them 4 years ago, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, they would have sworn to you that racism did not exist. Now, when we first moved down here to Tennessee, and they had a little shock with some of the different things that they saw and experienced, and then when the election began to come about, those were when they got some of their first taste in certain things. And they were then hearing some of the things that I had been telling them. They then said, okay, maybe this thing is real, but it's only in this little area. But now with the things that they have been seeing, they are in shock. And they're kind of like, well, what do we do with this? How do we deal with this? How do we handle this? Because this hasn't been on our radar. We haven't been brought up this way, because you brought us up in this way under these circumstances. We had friends of this culture, that culture, all these different cultures, and we were able to go and do as we want to. But now we feel as though we can't. But at the same time, you were the one that raised us not to go out of a store without a bag, without a receipt, without this, without that, with all these different things, because of who we are, because of our skin. And even though it annoyed us, we did it anyway. Right. And our goddaughter, I raised her with those same principles. And again, I have to remind her when she says, well, I don't feel as though I need to, I would tell her, because that's a part of your culture telling you you don't have to. And that is a privilege that you feel as though you have, when the reality of it is that you need to.
Now, Bridgette, you have children. Tell me about, do you have something to say about what Melinda was talking about?
Yeah. I actually had a question, because I found what Melinda was saying was really interesting. She said that, she had friends who were mixed. I find that term interesting too. It sounds like a drink. But so when you say people get to choose, which one they identify with more, do you think that's based on their choice, or do you think a lot of that is based on biology? So, right. So for example, I could be mixed, but my hair is kinky, not necessarily wavy. I could be on the browner side, and versus looking like a Vanessa Williams, right, with the blue eyes and the stringy hair that's beautiful and all of those things. So do you think some of how we choose, if we have that option, is also not really a choice, but the kind of whichever box we fit best in?
That is a great question. And we actually, and when I say we, my husband, I, and my goddaughter were having a similar discussion here about this over this past weekend. My husband tends to identify more with the African-American community. Although he looks Hispanic, he has very wavy hair, very gorgeous wavy hair. He has green eyes. But he identifies more with the African-American community because that was his experience. He was raised in the African-American community, and he said that growing up, he was accepted more in the African-American community, whereas in the white community, he was shunned and was basically told, you're not one of us, stay away from us. Whereas in the African-American community, he was told, oh, come on, let's go, let's play. And he was accepted. So that's where his experience is. And that's where he identifies and goes to. His biological brother, same mother, same father, the hair is different, the eyes are different, but that is his biological brother. And so the makeup is a little bit different, but he still identifies, and for the same reasons. It was an acceptance piece. And so for that, and I think when they say that, it makes me to lead that maybe not so much the biology, but I think the acceptance. It's kind of like kids on a playground with a ball, that if I have a ball and I walk up to you and I go, do you want to play? And someone says, yes, you have that connection. And whoever you form those connections with is where you tend to go. And so sometimes I think it's connection, other times it could be assimilation. Who do I look like? Who do I walk like? Who do I sound like? Who do I have a connection with? This may be like me. So it could be any of those things. But my goddaughter, I think she's still kind of finding her way and finding a place, because she feels like, as she has said it, that if she chooses one, she feels like she's betraying the other. And so she tends to leave herself open to not choose either. And so she hasn't had that experience yet to definitively say, I am one over the other.
Right.
Now,
It's sad that she has to.
now I have
Right.
biracial children. My oldest two are half Hispanic, half white, and they identify with the white community because their fathers weren't there growing up. It's not something I forced on them. It just was how they were growing up. Well, my son was he was 1 when I started dating my husband, and 2 when we got married. And I think that he identifies 50-50 black-white, even though he's half Hispanic. And then the youngest two are 50-50. My oldest, I think she identifies more with the white community because that's where she grew up. However, when she was 2, on one side was my sister, which is all white family, and on the other side was an all black family, and she loved going to both houses. She didn't choose one over the other for the race is, for a race reason. She chose my sister because it was her aunt, but when their granddaughter was next door, she would go next door, and I would have to say, okay, that's fine. I don't have a problem with it because I didn't. And I would go and sit with the grandmother and talk with the grandmother while the girls played. And I love the fact that she had that best friend that was African-American growing up. Understand that. We are actually about out of time. So I want to ask, will y'all join me for one more show? One more show. Yeah. Okay.
Everybody. This is cool.
Great. Thank y'all so much.
Okay.
Alrighty.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.